What's happening, plebs? We're really out here with another discussion video, and we'll be looking at, in 1 month's time, we'll have the North American World Championship Qualifier, probably the biggest, most prestigious event in the whole of Yu-Gi-Oh! That actually matters. Let's be honest, Worlds is it's not really a good test of, a massive player pool and stuff. So Nationals, in about a month, Euros in about a month and a week or something like that, I believe. So I'd like to talk about what I think are going to be some of the better decks that you can take to these events and do well with. So number 5, we have the Fire King Cosmo variant. This is the basically trapless one that doesn't rely on stunning your opponent. You'll probably still be running some Cosmojos and Call of the Haunteds, but for the most part, this is the combo based variant. This is the Fire King version, blowing up your hand, spamming out the field with different pilots and ships and Xyz. I think this version is still very potent, still very powerful. It can still make some of the most unfair boards in this game, but for some reason it just didn't really kick off. It's been a little bit fragile. The consistency of the deck has sort of not really been to the extent that people expected it to, because of the fact that it kind of suffers from the same problems that Monarchs do, where instead of tribute fodder and tribute summons, you require pilots and ships, and sometimes you have mismatches. Sometimes you just have different combinations of cards that don't really work, despite having a lot of card advantage. So not probably the strongest one to take to to these coming events, but I think that their Cosmo is Dark Destroyer is still a big deal for a lot of decks. Being able to just have insane OTK potential is still a big deal. So that's why I've put this deck as number 5. At number 4, we have Pendulum variants. Pendulum decks dropped off the radar with the limiting of Ignister and Face Off, just having no real consistent way of dealing with Dark Destroyer. The fact that the deck loses to back row really hard, especially with the resurgence of trap decks, Demise being a huge thing. So yeah, the deck does struggle a lot going second, for example. I think whoever manages to make this deck work will probably find a way to balance between making first turn really good boards in the same way that Ariadne used to do, but also being able to deal with going second, because a lot of decks this format, in fact pretty much every deck this format, wants to go first despite the hand advantage. So you'll be needing to play a Pendulum variant that doesn't lose and brick going second. So if you have traps in your hand, that's not going to help. But you also need to be able to deal with the fact that sometimes you're not going to win the dice roll, and you need to somehow be able to come up with the hands and combos that the generation before used to be able to do with Pendulums. So not as strong as it used to be, but of course the Pendulum mechanic is extremely powerful. One of the best mechanics ever created, probably the best, most strongest mechanic ever created, of once per turn soul charge. Yeah, it's busted. And between now and the North American WCQ and Euros, someone perhaps may have figured the deck out. But for the time being, it doesn't seem like the deck is as strong as it once was, and still has a lot of problems dealing with Cosmo, dealing with back row, dealing with Stormforth on your own turn and things like that. So that's why I put this deck as number 4. Number 3, we have Demise variants. Now this includes things like Cliffors, Cosmo, bloody Yusenju even, but obviously for the most part we're talking about Clifford Demise. But Cosmo Demise is just as good, and pretty much any other deck that can run set 5, like Tellarknights, even Tellarknight Demise is a thing as well somehow. All these kind of decks, but primarily Clifford Demise. I think that this is probably going to be one of the better decks this format. It's extremely ignorant, just being able to just shut down all your opponent's plays, flood them with rivalry and lose a turn, or rippling away their entire field. Just having an answer to every situation, flooding every single mechanic in the game, is extremely powerful, and being able to draw a new hand every turn with things like Demise and Monolith. The deck is extremely unfair. It's Twin Twister doesn't even help, because you just have so much advantage with Demise now. Beating this deck is a real travesty. I have a video on my channel explaining the best ways that you can beat Clifforts with the top 5 side cards, and I think that everyone should definitely be very prepared for these decks at the major events. I think just the sheer ignorance of the deck allows people to just pilot it to, a very consistent and average level of skill and still do really well because of the fact that just trap cards and floodgates in general are just so powerful if you're drawing like 2 or 3 of them every turn, you know what I mean? So that's why I put this deck at number 3. At number 2 we have Burning Abyss. Burning Abyss is a deck that I feel has lost a bit of its power from before. There was a period in time where it kind of wasn't really a thing because of, the advent of Monarchs, Dominion especially, with Cosmos being a big thing with Fire King Island, at least at the start, near the start of the format, having an issue dealing with big ships and such. But, the deck is extremely powerful, able to, make multiple Dantes and Beatrices and to wall up and to float and to never really die and have an amazing grind game to be able to deal with almost any situation with cards like F-Zero, Beatrice being able to disrupt anything, Kaiju's being able to be played as well in tandem with your Beatrice with the Slumber Send and stuff like that. The deck is just extremely versatile, and that's kind of why I think this deck is going to be one of the better variants for Euros and North American WCQ, because of the fact that it's so versatile. It's just able to deal with almost any situation. It doesn't have a particularly bad matchup against anything except maybe Monarchs. So the fact that this deck just has an all-round good match, I think is a really, really good shout. Don't think it's going to be that good as Monarchs. I think it's going to have, it's always had a weak Monarch matchup. I think that Monarchs in general are just going to be a little bit better, which I think is the reason why this deck can't be the number 1 spot, because I feel that objectively Monarchs are better than Burning Abyss head to head, but just because of how good the Burning Abyss matchup is like across the board, I think makes this deck a huge contender. I did take this to my own nationals and I didn't do as well as I hoped, but that's just because for some reason the UK meta is all Monarchs. So if you're expecting a lot of Monarchs, this is going to be higher up the list. If you're expecting no Monarchs or a few Monarchs, which isn't really going to happen, but let's say there's more Cosmo, which is a thing in America. Americans seem to love Cosmo more than Monarchs, so I feel like if that's going to be the case at a major event, Cosmo, just a very popular archetype. Burning Abyss is like definitely a lot stronger than it would be over here. So this list isn't like entirely perfect, but it will kind of depend on region and different metas shifting across the week gap that we have between Euros and North American Nationals. But yeah, like I said, the deck is very versatile and it has an okay matchup across the board, but I think maybe that's kind of where the biggest drawback for Burning Abyss is the fact that it's okay against everything. It doesn't particularly excel against everything, which, its advantage might actually be a disadvantage in the long run if you really think about it. But I still think it's worth the number 2 spot for this discussion. Number 1, we have Monarch variants, Tzolk'in, Brilliant Fusion, even Dominion. Like, the deck is just so powerful. Stormforth is just the most unfair card, like, this past year. It's really been the highlight of this season. Erebus being able to shuffle away ships and then tribute over a guy that you have. Pantheism just digging through your deck and getting you pluses and not being able to get killed because of Prime and aethering on your opponent's turn. The mirror match tends to be particularly skillful, so as a tournament deck it's actually very, very strong because of the fact that if you're the better player, you should be winning most of your mirror matches, you should be beating Burning Abyss, you should be beating Cosmo, you're able to get around back row and dodge things like Strike with things like Return of the Monarchs, and the deck just has an all-round great matchup against everything. Unlike Burning Abyss, which is okay against everything, Monarchs just seem to be great against everything. They get even random rogue decks like Stormforth just shits on everything. That's just the fact. Stormforth, there's nothing in this game that's relevant right now that Stormforth doesn't deal with. Erebus just deals with everything as well. The most random rogue thing you can think of, Monarchs probably can out it in some shape or form. Against Klee, which is maybe its hardest matchup because of things like rivalry, just being able to dig through your deck game 2 and 3 with things like Pantheism and stuff like that, to be able to reach your Twin Twisters, Full Houses, Trapstuns, Decrees, whatever it may be, just has such a strong game like this format. Against the mirror match, for example, usually the better player will win, but sometimes you need to be careful when thinking about tournament settings because mirror matches and Monarchs can be hour-long game ones, and that's something you need to prepare for going into a tournament. It's something you need to consider, something you have to really think about is time. When you're playing at locals, when you're playing with your friends, when you're playing on DN, when you're testing with each other, you don't have this concept of time of losing, like in turn 4. That just doesn't exist. But you really need to think about this when you're going into a tournament, which I think is what it's going to be the biggest downfall for Monarchs themselves, is the fact that you're going to be playing so many mirror matches that result in you just losing to other Monarch players. But generally the better Monarch player will win if time be allowed, but you need to take into account things like time. Still, I think it's probably the strongest tournament deck we have currently. But the issue is with all these decks that I mentioned is that nothing particularly has an edge against anything. If you want to play a deck for the European Championship or the North American Championship, you need a deck that's going to be able to deal with Stormforce for Rebus, that doesn't lose to Stormforce for Rebus, but also can deal with ignorant cards like Floodgates and Dart Destroyer. So it's really hard to innovate this format. It's really hard to come up with something new and fresh because of the problems that the current decks sort of deal with. Because like I said, Monarchs just deal with rogue stuff very, very well. Cosmo just give a really tough time to anything that relies on targeting or can't really put out big guys. So it's hard to come up with something new, but I think this is my list for this tournament season. So let me know what you think down below. If I missed the mark on any points, what do you think of my analysis? Do you think I've gone wrong anywhere? If you think that certain things should be in different places, I'd like to hear that. So by all means, tell me if you think, for example, Burning Abyss or number 5. Tell me if you think, Demise is the best deck, or Monarchs or number 5. I'd like to get a little bit of debate and discussion going in the comments. So yeah, I'm just curious to find out what your opinions are. Let me know what you think down below, and we'll see you next time.
Come, face me, give in to your pride, show